deep within every person's skull. An ancient monster lies imprisoned.
It has no interest in the laws of survival. Its only sustenance is pure joy.
In 1953, psychologist James Olds accidentally found the key to awakening
Due to a
it.
tiny mistake, he misplaced the electrode that should have been implanted in the brainstem into the septal area of the rat's brain. After the experiment began, something strange occurred. When Olds pressed...
After that, the rat became obsessed with returning to that spot repeatedly, as if it was waiting for something. Olds keenly realized that he might have inadvertently stumbled upon a switch that could directly generate rewards within the skull. He quickly refined the experiment by installing a lever inside a box that would trigger a self-administered electrical stimulation each time the rat pressed it. As a result, one of the most tragic addicts in the history of science was born. The rat it became a prisoner willing to die for pleasure, and without intervention, would likely perish from exhaustion amid endless self-stimulation. It frantically pressed the lever thousands of times per hour, abandoning food, ignoring sleep, and even willingly crossing electrified grid. What Olds had discovered was the brain's reward center. It proved in an almost cruel manner that once this most primal drive for pure pleasure is activated, even our instinct for survival becomes subordinated. This revolt within the confines of the laboratory cage was not an anomaly. Years later, American psychiatrist Heath implanted electrodes into the brains of human patients. Patient B, 19, after receiving the button, reported unprecedented euphoria and violently protested when the stimulation was terminated, desperately pleading for just a few more sessions. What exactly is this pleasure button that can drive living beings to their death?
At first, all clues pointed to dopamine. Scientists discovered that whether it's rats self-administering electrical...
For a period, dopamine was hailed as the molecule of pleasure, and addiction appeared to be simply an insatiable chase for the bliss it generated. However, in 1997, when Schultz aimed electrodes at monkey brains, he unexpectedly exposed this deception. In an experiment where juice was provided when a light turned on, he discovered that initially, when the monkey unexpectedly tasted the juice, its dopamine neurons would fire excitedly.
But when the monkey became familiar with the pattern, dopamine neurons actually went silent when drinking the juice.
When the anticipated juice reward was absent following light activation, dopamine levels dropped precipitously, seemingly reflecting a neural representation of disappointment. Schultz recognized that dopamine did not represent pleasure per se, but rather constituted a forecast of pleasure. It encoded reward prediction error. When reality exceeds expectations, it surges dramatically, driving us to learn how to obtain this surprise again. When reality falls short of expectations, it delivers punishment through neural silence. It is not a hedonist, but rather a stern mentor. Its mission is to ensure we learn to survive with maximum efficiency, not to let us indulge in pleasure itself. Shortly thereafter, another researcher, Barrage, uncovered an additional conspirator in this revolt. He found that the brain's reward circuitry comprises two fundamentally distinct components, liking and wanting. Dopamine serves as the driving force behind wanting, but the actual pleasurable sensation of liking is more associated with opioid substances such as endorphins. This means that the core of addiction is a malignant separation between wanting and liking. When substances repeatedly stimulate the brain, the dopaminergic system develops hypersensitivity, magnifying wanting to pathological levels, while the brain's hedonic systems progressively desensitize, resulting in diminishing pleasurable effects from equivalent dosages. Thus addicts fall into a terrifying paradox. They desperately want those substances, even though they can no longer bring much liking. What they pursue is no longer pleasure, but rather an unsatisfiable specter of craving driven by dopamine. Thus, addiction is not merely a pleasure-seeking despot, but rather a shrewd manipulator. It commandeers the brain's most primitive learning circuitry, ensnaring individuals in a self-perpetuating reinforcement loop.
And the battlefield of this rebellion has long since spread from drugs to every corner of our lives.
Casino slot machines capitalize on intermittent reinforcement, ensnaring players in the perpetual expectation of an imminent jackpot. Each like and swipe on our devices constitutes a microinjection of dopamine, tethering us firmly to our screens and ensnaring us in an endless cycle of craving, while seldom providing authentic hedonic satisfaction. Given that addiction represents a neurologically driven revolt, is escape still within the realm of possibility? In 1981, an experiment by Alexander brought a glimmer of hope to this question. He argued that the prior experimental conditions constituted a form of torment in themselves. Therefore, he constructed a rat park. This environment featured comfortable bedding of wood shavings, varied enrichment toys, social companions for interaction, and plentiful food sources. Then, he provided the rats with two choices, pure water and sugar water laced with morphine. In contrast to the self-stimulating rodents, he achieved diametrically opposite findings. Rats housed in the enriched environment demonstrated minimal interest in the morphine solution, favoring social interaction, play, and exploration instead. When Alexander relocated the morphine-dependent rats from isolated caging to the enriched environment, the majority progressively ceased morphine consumption and resumed normal behavioral patterns. Additionally, research on returning Vietnam War veterans offered comparable supporting evidence. Within the high-pressure and tedious conditions of the Vietnam War theater, approximately 20% of U.S. military personnel developed heroin dependency. However, upon returning home, more than 90% spontaneously ceased their dependency without undergoing formal treatment interventions.
This means that addiction is closely tied to environment, to social connections, and to whether life has meaning.
In many cases, addiction represents a symptom. It constitutes a distress signal, masking underlying loneliness, trauma, or desperation. When reality becomes saturated with suffering and lacks meaning, the brain instinctively pursues any alternative that offers momentary relief, be it chemical or behavioral in nature. Yet contemporary discourse frequently exhibits selective amnesia regarding this fundamental insight. We become fixated on dopamine detox protocols, willpower conditioning, productivity optimization strategies, and ultimately place our faith in pharmaceutical interventions, or even more targeted neurosurgical procedures. This approach strategically deflects accountability entirely onto the individual trapped within their circumstances, as though addiction were simply a defect in their individual neurological system. This constitutes a more subtle form of dependency who have developed an addiction to personal remedies. Because they offer the promise of a manageable, predictable future while enabling us to evade the more formidable underlying issues. To what extent is the modern society we inhabit essentially one enormous, elaborately decorated Skinner box? When stable communities disintegrate, when work becomes alienated from meaning, and when consumerism continuously manufactures insatiable wanting, have we not all become, to varying degrees, those rats imprisoned alone in cages?
Therefore, our true struggle with desire perhaps lies not just within the individual, but in the world we collectively inhabit.
Liberating the prisoners of pleasure ultimately relies not on more effective drugs or stronger willpower, but on a more profound social inquiry. How might we cease erecting these intangible cages and collectively reconstruct a human sanctuary capable of accommodating genuine pleasure and cultivating purpose?